I'm very happy today to have with me Patrick D. McCoy, and he is an educator, a performer, a choir director, and a music critic. Hello, Patrick.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah, I'm glad you could join me. This is like what the third week of Black History Month, and
Yes.
so we're gonna have a lot to talk about. But first of all, tell me a little bit about yourself, how you got started in music.
Well, Carolyn, that is a long story, so I'll try to give you the Clip Notes version, but
Okay.
I am a native of Petersburg, Virginia, which is south of Richmond. And Petersburg is my home, and I've always been surrounded by music. My mother, my late mother, Velma Ann McCoy Pulley, she sang in the church choir, but our home church, Unity Baptist Church, it was more of a gospel orientation. So the first music I heard was definitely in the church. But even prior to that, before we even transitioned to being in the Baptist church, most people don't know that my family and myself in particular, my sister, my brother, we were raised Church of Christ. So initially speaking, before we even went to the Baptist church, of course, Church of Christ, the music is a cappella. And then at some, part of the junction, we transitioned to the Baptist church and we went to the Unity Baptist church. And my mother was very active in the choir. Now, this church, it was a gospel music background, so it was not a lot about, reading music and so forth. It's more like when the beat hits you, that's what you got, the rhythm of the church and the soulful singing. It was more natural, for lack of better words.
Well, Patrick, was it like
And
that kind of old time gospel music that we kind
yes,
of grew up hearing?
yes.
Hmm.
And I wish I would have taken more, kind of more of an interest in it. But when you're a child, you don't really recognize things because I remember the organist there, Miss Neverson, who's actually related to Trey Songz, the popular singer now. But she used to be on that organ, and she would, what we would say, she would just really rock the organ and boot the organ. So it was no drum set, but the rhythm of her playing really
With
kept
that
the pulse.
Hammond
Yes,
with the feet, yes. Uh-huh.
it really kept the pulse, throughout the service. So that was my first like experience. Like most, I would say, African American musicians, it came from the church. But the classical music aspect kind of came later. And let me just go back to the situation with the church. Yes, my mother sang in the choir, and that was kind of embraced because it was a gospel style.
Hmm.
But for some reason, there was an interest. Like I didn't play an instrument, but I always gravitated towards the piano. And they had piano. They had a piano in the basement of the church, and they had a piano in the sanctuary. That in the Black tradition, for the most part, you don't carry your butt in that pulpit. You don't get on those instruments unless you are the trained people who minister in those spaces.
Oh yeah.
So a lot of time when you were a young child, you would get scolded. But for some reason, I guess that didn't bother me because I would still go and be near the piano and all that. But I remember it was always a constant. When I went to go noodle around on the piano, they were like, "Boy, stop playing on that piano, stop making that noise." So it was always like a constant kind of chastising, in that situation. So I'm trying to get to a lot of this stuff because, even though that happened, my neighborhood that I was raised in at that time, it was a mixed neighborhood. You had white families and you had black families, and our family was one of the first, I would say, black families uh, in our neighborhood and on our street. So I had a variety of friends, both black and white. But
Hmm.
I remember very distinctly me and my white friends who I used to play with very often. We were out and about, and I forgot exactly the area we were in, but for some reason we were near a dumpster. We were near a dumpster, and I don't know if you remember those chord organs. Like it was like a half a keyboard, and it was like the whole octave. It was like a half a keyboard. Then there were these little buttons that you push for the chords, so you could play the melody like maybe in your right hand, but you could do the whole chord by pushing this button. It was like
Yeah.
it was a little small thing. But I noticed that it was in the dumpster in this area where we were playing. Carolyn, I got that thing out of the dumpster.
You saved it.
Yeah. So I got the thing out of the dumpster and I brought it home. And so remember I talked about the whole idea when we was at the church, like the people would chastise me, but when I brought it home, my mother was like, boy, what you doing bringing this junk, you did this piece of junk home? But Carolyn, it was a blessing that my mother never expected because, as I mentioned to you, she used to sing in the church choir, and it wasn't like a formal reading octavos or anything like that. Like I said, this church didn't sing anthems or anything like that. But when I brought that organ home at first, the receptiveness was more like, okay, why are you bringing this home? But my mother sang solos in the church choir.
Yeah.
Her favorite hymn was Come Ye Disconsolate, even though that's not a gospel hymn, it's really traditional, but that was my mother's favorite hymn, Come Ye Disconsolate. But she also sang like those gospel solos, like, or gospel hymns, like He Touched Me. That was another favorite of hers.
Hmm.
And I remember that she used to sing He Touched Me as a solo. And she was singing it one day, and I started noodling around on that little dilapidated organ that I, salvaged from the trash.
Yeah.
And I started being able to pick songs up by ear. So she was so surprised that I began to pick up that particular song by ear without any musical training. And
How old were
so,
you? How old were
gosh,
you?
I probably was maybe like, I would say maybe like 11, 12 years old.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Yeah, so that's kind of late when you're starting to really learn the keyboard and all that.
Yeah.
But it was interesting. I really started playing, what people would term as by ear. And so my mother was very surprised at that point. So it became almost a ritual, like every Saturday morning, because my mother worked. My mother was a custodian, so she always was at the school at varying times, depending on the shift that she worked, at the school,
Hmm.
doing that. But it became ritual that on Saturday mornings, my mother would be preparing these solos, and I ended up really being, in essence, my mother's first vocal coach, even though I necessarily didn't have any training. So
That's
that's how
great.
it, yeah, so that's how it kind of began. The starting point, the most important starting point for me beyond anything I could ever do is music in the church, and how my mother and that situation with the organ and all that kind of propelled me into the direction of having a very serious interest in
Yeah,
music.
ground to cover, but just talk a little bit about your musical education before
A
college
little bit
and
because you have provided a wonderful segue. In Petersburg, Petersburg is a small town, but I was afforded to be exposed to great mentors. And there's several, but I want to point out that one of my biggest mentors,
hmm
Dr. James Franklin Peake Jr. Dr. Peake, affectionately, I call him Jim. He always welcomed me to call him by his first name. I know sometimes when you're a younger person, people
you
kind of
don't do
struggle
that.
with that. Yeah, but my high school, I want to say it was my biology teacher, Coach Dyer, Coach Ben Dyer. Coach Dyer always had a record of inviting his students to church, and Mr. Dyer, Coach Dyer was also um, a white teacher that I had, but
Hmm.
Coach Dyer was a member of West End Baptist Church. But West End had a reputation for being a very high, affluent white Baptist church. It wasn't your typical Baptist church, Southern Baptist church. It was very high. It was the pipe organ, the sanctuary choir did these big, huge anthems. When they put the hymns in the bulletin, they put the hymn tunes, they cited the composers, and that was all much of to Jim's doing. And
Hmm.
so when I went to this church, how it came about was Mr. Dyer or Coach Dyer, he invited me to church. It was something in awe from when I went to the church the first time
Hey,
because when I walked,
hold on one second. I have to ask
uh-huh.
this question. Was the coach white or black?
Yes, he was white.
Okay, so that's Petersburg, Virginia, still the South, going
Yes.
to a white Baptist church, bringing this little black kid into the church. Okay, go ahead.
Well, they wasn't one like, he ministered to all of the students. He was
Hmm.
like the coach of like a lot of the sports teams. So even though, yeah, he was the coach, he always introduced, even so,
Yeah.
he invited me to that church. And as I was going into, like, when I walked into the space, I was in awe of the big pipe organ. It was a very grand church, and they had this art. So they used to have this dinner back in the day, they used to have these family night suppers, and that dinner was in conjunction with the service. So I would never forget. I went to the dinner that they had. I was invited to that, and they had a piano in the fellowship hall because these dinners would be in the fellowship hall. And I
Hmm.
just happened to be noodling around, on the piano. And Jim Peak, of course, I didn't know he was there. He was listening to me play. And so he introduced himself as the music director. So Jim Peak heard me noodling around on the piano. I wasn't playing anything fancy, but that Carol, that turned into him asking me, Patrick, would you like to come play? Now, mine. So in this instance, Jim heard the potential. He was like, well, Patrick, we would love for you to come and play the offertory or organ piece. But at any rate, I got featured in that prominent spot in their service. So I would get featured, and it was consistent. And at the same time, in tandem that I was discovering my abilities at the keyboard, my voice really grew. And so this is where with Jim, he not only noticed my abilities at the keyboard, he began to really notice my singing voice. And as a teenager, I sang in his choir at West End Baptist Church. And I was probably the youngest person in the choir. But that is where I got my true exposure, to the Western European masterworks. It was because of Jim
Because
Peak.
I think a lot of times, we don't we have to honor our ancestors, whoever they are, right? And
Yes.
and give them their props, as I say. So go ahead.
Well, oh my goodness. And the way you say that, I get so full because he didn't put up the boundary that sometimes people like to put up. Like, as I mentioned, in our culture, you would never call somebody not even 10, 15, 20 years older than you by their first name unless they welcome you to do so. And even when they welcome you to do so, there's a strangeness that you feel. But with
Yeah.
Jim, he always insisted, and we've always had that rapport. But I want to go back to him and so even when I got out of high school, he had an open door policy, and I would go to his office. Now, Carolyn, every time I went to his office, he gave me a recording to listen to. Always. So this is where I got to listen to all of these recordings of, and I've had too many or so many full circle moments, too many to count, because a lot of the great black singers that I was exposed to then were on recordings. But in regards to Jim Peak, he was a big Robert Shaw buck, the Atlanta Symphony, all of the recordings and things like that. And
Hmm.
it was by him where I began to be introduced to this mezzo soprano named Marietta Simpson. So well over 20 years ago, I heard Miss Simpson on these recordings, never realizing that I would meet her all these years later, have a friendly rapport. And back then, I never made the connection as I did moving to Washington, that Marietta Simpson is the sister, of course, of Evelyn Security like that. But it all
Hmm.
started because of Jim Peak, his mentorship, the way that he, gave me these recordings to listen to. And this is another full circle moment that I had, when I really got immersed in liturgical music and playing for the Episcopal Church, which I adore. But I used to listen to this recording that Jim gave me called Hymns and Motets. It featured the St. John's Lafayette Square Choir, and at that time, that choir was under the direction of Samuel Carabetta. And so that was a full circle moment because Jim gave me that CD all those years ago, only for me to move to Washington to actually meet Samuel Carabetta, and we are friends. And that's the same thing with Marietta Simpson. I never imagined that I would have been listening to these artists on CDs. I just thought I was listening to CDs, never knowing that I was being prepared for these moments that I enjoy now, being surrounded and immersed, you know, with these, exceptional artists.
Yeah,
So
community. Yeah. So let's jump now because you found, or he found you, you found him, the universe made it possible. And then you're in college. Let's just jump like towards the end of the college, teaching in public school a little bit, and then to DC, because that's where the writing started, if I recall correctly.
Yes. So I do need to put a little plug for the high school going to Virginia State because I had a wonderful high school music teacher, Donna Lundy, Mrs. Donna Reed Lundy. And
Mm-hmm.
Mrs. Lundy, but it was Miss Lundy that really prepared me for that. My first competition piece, and she prepared me for my audition at Virginia State. Because Mrs. Janella L. Edmonds, who had a reputation for excellence and not taking any junk or
Yeah, we've all had a
mediocrity.
few teachers like that.
So I heard about Mrs. Edmonds more like word of mouth, you
Yeah.
know, from Mrs. Lundy. And so I knew that, you know, I was definitely gonna be prepared when I went to audition for her. But Miss Edmonds, when I first got in the choir, Carolyn, first of all, my voice, as I would say, a lot of persons of color, when people listen to your voice, they say, "Oh, your voice is dark. Oh, you're a tenor. Are you sure you're not a baritone?" Da 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 da. So when I got to Virginia State in the concert choir singing there, I sang like baritone in the choir. Now my peacock feathers were definitely ruffled because I definitely knew that. Oh, I was a tenor and da 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 da. But I'm gonna tell you a cute little aside. There was one time we had this concert. It was a Christmas concert, and it opened with this big Bach motet. I was the only, I was the only tenor available because I knew the tenor line and the baritone line because, as I shared, I was singing the baritone section, but sometimes I would sing the tenor part. But on this occasion, I was the only person who knew the tenor part that showed up. So yeah, you had all the baritone. I was the only tenor there to sing the part. But from that point on, I earned my place. I finished Virginia State. I just knew that I was going to be a recitalist. I loved early music. I knew that I was just going to, sing all the Purcell and the Handel and the Bach and the Carissimi and all of that kind of stuff like that. I love that. But to get to your question, Virginia State definitely prepared me. I could go on Google's about that, but Virginia State definitely prepared me. The focus was, I would be honest, like we didn't have, I don't think, how can I say this? I think resources are deployed to where they want to put them in the HBCU structure. If you're familiar with HBCU, you know a big part of the culture is definitely
Band.
the band, and the football team and the band works in tandem with that, and that brings all the big bucks to the institution, not just Virginia State, but any institution. But to answer your question, it wasn't a lot of opportunities where famous, I would say, concert singers, particularly black singers, came to Virginia State, but they definitely tried their best to make sure that you knew who Camilla Williams was, because of course, Camilla Williams was, I would say, our prominent representative, as far as the opera world. But I would
Mm-hmm.
say this: we had wonderful, not necessarily classical music experiences, but at Virginia State they had something that was called a Lyceum series, and they would host all of these people of note, whether it was writers or scholars. But I would say the biggest joy of my life at Virginia State in that regard was not a singer, it was an instrumentalist, and that person was Wynton Marsalis.
Wow.
Yes, back in 1998. And it's so funny. He had a larger engagement at the University of Richmond, in Richmond. He had appeared there on this big lecture series, and it just so happened that they worked it out so he could come to Virginia State and also speak and share with us.
Mm-hmm.
And so when he came, I was just mesmerized because I had already seen him back in the day when you went to the record stores. I was already enamored with him and Miss Battle because the first recording that really truly introduced me to classical music, to know that, hey, my black brothers and sisters are out here really doing the thing as far as classical music, was the album Baroque Duet, with all the Baroque showpieces with Mr. Marcellus and
But
Miss
but
Battle.
can I tell you a little quick story?
Sure.
When I first started at Juilliard, Winton was a student there, and I didn't know who he was, but I saw him, and I'd see this cute guy coming down the hall, afro, and he go like, "Hey," I go, "Hey," That would be about it. Out of time to get to the heart of our conversation today, which is
Okay.
about being a music critic. So
Okay.
let's talk about your transfer to Washington D.C. This is after you've been teaching in public school for a while,
Yes,
and
yes.
you've already done your master's at Shenandoah, and we'll talk about how we met
No, no,
too.
no, no, no. And I have to, as I mentioned early on, my mother was a custodian. She was a custodian for many years in the Petersburg public schools. But I always tell people, if there's nobody else you better be friends with, it better be the people in the cafeteria staff and the custodian. Because yeah, you might have somebody who's in leadership, but the custodian always has those keys. Where you get locked out of your classroom, it's the custodian recording. Because I think this is important. That story was very important. I was mentioning my mother was the custodian at the school, and I had just finished Virginia State, so she was in the cafeteria cleaning the cafeteria, and the principal, the late Miss Gail Alexander, she was looking for a music teacher. So she was, voicing that concern, and my mother was like, "I know the perfect person." So in a nutshell, this principal hired me, but the full circle moment is Miss Alexander was my eighth grade civic teacher. That's why you don't burn bridges. I never imagined that my eighth grade civics teacher would be the principal of this school where my mother was the custodian.
And
And
you
so
get your first job.
it was my first job, fresh out
Mm-hmm.
of school. And so
Mm-hmm.
my so and so to move a little ahead of that, when I was teaching, I enjoyed the students, but I felt like I wanted more. And I wanted to pursue graduate studies. So after I taught 3 years in Petersburg, I wanted to go to graduate school. And I'm going to tell this story because it's perfect. It ties in perfectly. I applied for graduate school at Virginia Commonwealth University. And
Where
I
is
never really
that?
called out in Richmond. So a lot of people really prize that program. They're really known for their arts program. And
Mm-hmm.
so when I applied for graduate school there, not to, talk negative, but in essence, I was not accepted there. I had a great audition and all of that. But the person who interviewed me said it was like they were like, "Oh, you have great talent, but I don't think this is it, it's the place for you, da 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 da." But it wasn't like, uplifting. It was like, you can sing, you can conduct, blah, 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 but this is not the place for you. So just to move ahead from that, I was kind of discouraged. And
Yeah.
so I ended up thinking more. Not only did I get accepted to Shenandoah, it was at the same time that I was also hired as the minister of music at Tacoma Park Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. And at that time, I was still director of music at Covenant Presbyterian Church. So to go back a little bit, when I got the acceptance to Shenandoah,
Mm-hmm.
I still kept my job in Petersburg. Okay, and I know this is kind of a lot to
No,
digest.
Petersburg is a long way. That's south of Richmond, right?
Yeah, it's 30 minutes
Okay.
from Richmond. But from Winchester, it's 3 hours away. So when I got accepted to Shenandoah, I actually moved from Petersburg to Winchester. I lived in Winchester during the week, but I still maintained my main church job at Covenant Presbyterian Church. And they accepted that. They made sure I didn't have to do a rehearsal or anything during the week. The only thing I would do is show up on Sunday. So anyway, to fast forward from that, when I decided that I was going to go to graduate school, um, that's when I left Petersburg, because I let me go back. So I know it's a lot, and I'm trying to get it because it's just trying to put it all
It's
together.
okay.
So when I got the opportunity, I finished graduate school. That's what I wanted to get to. When I was at Petersburg, I through all that time, I finished my work at Shenandoah, but I got hired for the job at Tacoma Park Baptist Church in DC. And that's when I actually moved and I came to DC. It was not based on the writing part, it was because I got a job as the minister of music at Tacoma Park Baptist Church. And then in tandem with that, I got hired to teach in the Prince George's County public schools. And the job at Tacoma Park Baptist Church came by way of Mrs. Hope. That was how that happened. And so I was there for 6 years. And then I ended up getting an invitation Really the writing part, let's just go ahead and get to that because like you said, that's the main thing that we're here for. My writing
Well,
professor,
the thing is, I love hearing people's stories, and but we have a finite amount of time. So why don't you talk to me about how you got involved in the writing? Because you graduated with the master's in choral conducting, was it?
it was sacred music. So the master is a master of church music
Okay.
from Shenandoah. So it was a combination of organ and voice. But the writing, I've always done a bit of writing, but I never saw that as a career. It was just something that I did. I wish I would have had my little trophy from when I was in the young authors contest in high school. But I never saw the writing. The writing really for me came out of hardship. And I was working part time at the Kennedy Center. I was working in the ticket office.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times in this season of my life when I was going through this hardship, I was renting a room. So the only thing I would do was work my part-time job at the Kennedy Center in conjunction with my job at the church, but I would come home and I would just come into this room. And at this time I wasn't driving or anything. It was more or less I was using public transportation and I would have this time in this room. One day I got this invitation to write for a column called examiner.com. And I kind of didn't pay any mind to it, but it was called the Kennedy Center Examiner, not because it was affiliated with the Kennedy Center. It was the expectation that if you wrote this column, you would start to maybe on your own pursue these concerts and report on them because it was called the Kennedy Center Examiner, not because of affiliation.
Mm-hmm.
So I signed up and I started writing this column. Now, mind you, I just mentioned to
Really?
you, this column started to get popular. I would start writing these columns, and then one day I kind of got
Well,
my
wait,
coattail.
Patrick. What was your first article? Who was it about?
It was like I want to say it wasn't about anybody per se. It was like a overview of concerts coming up in the DC area.
Okay.
I changed the column to the DC Performing Arts Examiner, and that was the best thing that I could have done because it gave me a broader reach. So I really got popular, and I talked about this a little while ago in another conversation because I said, hey, let's try this out. Let's start reaching out to people. So I reached out to the Washington Chorus, which is one of the big symphonic choirs here. And that particular year, they were doing the Mozart Requiem. And of course, Julian Wagner, who is the music director at Trinity Church, but at this time, he was just with the Washington Chorus as a conductor. And, at this time, I said, well, hey, let me just reach out to the Washington Chorus, about, hey, can I get some press tickets? And so they were the ones that really were welcoming. I reached out to them, I sent them an email, and they invited me. They sent me 2 press tickets. I said, wait a minute. I said, if I could reach out to them and get some press tickets, I'm on a roll. So again, they invited me. I covered the Mozart Requiem and Carolyn. Then I began to see, they posted that review on Facebook. At the time, Facebook wasn't inundated with all of these different conversations and things like it is now.
Yeah.
But they shared that review and it went like viral all over Facebook. I said, well, hey, if they're going to share it, I need to just reach out to every professional performing arts entity in Washington. And that's where it really blossomed. I said, oh, so then,
But now
my
I have
goal.
to stop. I have to stop and ask you. You know, people go to journalism school, and they specialize in political journalism or arts journalism and stuff. All of a sudden, here you are. You're involved in journalism. Did you reach out to anybody for pointers, or you just let the spirit
No,
guide you? Okay,
no.
okay,
I kind of and to your point, a lot of people, even myself, would say that I came in through the back door. But as you talk to people, you figure and you find out that a lot of people came through the back door. Like Amber Jet is one of my biggest mentors. I would say that she's one of the people who have supported me the most on that professional journalism side. And as we talked and she mentioned me, you know, she did a lot of writing, but it wasn't like the traditional path for her either. You know what I'm saying?
yeah.
She would probably tell you that she came in through the back door. But I think there was a different kind of receptiveness, during her time than it would be, for me. So no, to answer your question, no, I didn't go to journalism school. I always have had a passion for communicating stories, but I
Mhm.
never imagined that it would morph into what it is, now. And so from that point of me writing that simple column on examiner.com, I was sharing, before, the fact that, a lot of times we seek validation, like, if a writer, the validation is to most people, oh, I'm a legitimate writer because I'm writing for a publication. It was only years later to this point now that I realized I don't have to have my validation from a publication. People are coming to me to
Okay,
communicate these
I'm going to
stories.
ask you a dumb question. Is that the same as a byline?
I don't think so because you really can write your own byline. No one wrote a byline for me. I wrote my own byline. Like when I do things like for print and I describe myself. I describe myself the way I want to. Now, of course, people edit the byline down, but
Mhm.
I don't let publications write my byline and describe the narrative that I have for my writing style.
Mhm.
Like when I submit things, I tailor it. I guess I tailor it to best reflect, me and my writing. But, I think the main breakthrough that really um, let me recognize that I had value in this arena was I got the opportunity to cover this chamber music festival at Evermain Mansion in Georgetown. It was sponsored by this organization called the S&R Foundation. I know we're running for time, and just so much I could talk about this. But when I went to this event, it was a very posh event. It was very, like what some people would say, like hoity toity or whatever. It was
Yeah.
very nice. I went to
The
this event, and
champagne was probably good.
oh my goodness, it was. It wasn't burned. It wasn't burned like Dominique said about Alexis Champagne when she met her on Dynasty. That little scene with Diane Carroll and Joan Collins. But anyway, when I went to this event, there was a very professional man standing up at the door, and he had these magazines in his hand. I would never make the connection. This man was John Arundel, the associate publisher of Washington Life magazine. So when we got to the little interval, the intermission of his concert, we started talking. So I introduced myself to him. He introduced himself to me, but I didn't know that he was the publisher of the magazine until later. And he was like, he asking me, why was I there? And I said I was covering the event. He was like, who do you write for? I
Uh-huh.
said, I said examiner.com. He said, "Oh." And then, of course, in your mind, when it's an online publication, first thing that somebody says, "Oh, that's a blog." So he said, "Oh." He said, "Well, Patrick," he said, "it's good to write online, for a blog." He said, "But it's even better to be in print." If I would have had my attitude about me, I would have been like, "Oh, a blog? What are you trying to say?" But I really, Carolyn, I'm glad that I have matured in that way because I took in everything he said. He said, Patrick, he said, it's good to write online, it's good to write for a blog, but it's good to be in print, have your work in print. He
Mhm.
said, let me give you my information. And so he gave me his card. He said, I want you to email me your online, your online piece, which I did. Some was a mixture. At that time, I was already writing for the Afro American. I had already written some things for CBS Washington, a few other things that were established publications, but they were all online. So
Mhm.
I sent him all these online things, and so then maybe like a week or so later, he approached me. He said, Patrick, I want you to write a kind of a trial piece for my blog. There's a performance of My Fair Lady going on at Arena Stage, and I have this blog I want you to write for. So he himself had a blog. Now that's a small part of the puzzle.
Yeah.
So he got me the press clearance. I went to Arena Stage, which is the more theater-oriented hall here in Washington. They do a lot of excellent things, under the direction of Molly Smith, who's their director over there. But anyway, I went there. I wrote this piece for his blog, and he published it. He was so, pleased with it. But I
Uh-huh.
never made the connection between him and his blog at that point, and that he was the associate publisher of Washington Life magazine. And this is how he positioned it where he said, Patrick, I, presented your material to, the magazine, and we want to hire you as the magazine's first performing arts columnist. And so at the time, they had another editor there who was on staff, and I worked with her. And that's how I was able to position my column for the magazine called Perfect Pitch. This was the magazine's print column. And so that's where I was able, but there's another point to that I got to put it in. When we had that conversation at the big event, this is when Norman Scribner, the founder of the Choral Arts Society of Washington, first announced that he was retiring. And so in that conversation with John Arundel, he asked me, he said, Patrick, so who do you think is gonna get the first interview with Maestro Norman Scribner on the occasion of his retirement? And I said, with full arrogance, I said, I am. So I delivered. So really my official first piece for Washington Life was
Mm-hmm.
this interview with Norman Scribner, who of course is now deceased. And so that was like my first major piece on the Washington Life website online. But the print column was called Perfect Pitch, and that's where I delivered all of the luminaries, not all, but some of the major luminaries for them in print. And I couldn't believe it because my first interview in print for Perfect Pitch for the magazine was with Joshua Bell. And then they were like, oh my God, you landed Joshua Bell. So I began to land all of these major classical artists. And there was a variety. So it was Joshua Bell. Then the next column was Renee Fleming. Then probably one of the next, interviews was Denise Graves and Javon Gilliam, who is the principal timpanist of the National Symphony. And it just went on and on and on. So this column began to be very respected. And it wasn't, Carolyn, that I had to go through all of these people to get these interviews. I learned a long time ago, if you want to have a conversation with somebody, just like we're having this conversation, I didn't go through the middleman. I didn't go through a publicist. Now, granted, there have been a few times where a publicist has, laid the groundwork for me to have these conversations. But I
Yeah.
would say for the most part, I went directly to the source, especially like people like Denise Graves. And when I started my podcast in conjunction with, my print work, but it was Washington Life that I will say, it really kind of launched this direction where people really started to see my work. And then, of course,
You would
it
say
just
that's where you
really,
cut your teeth, huh?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And
But
that, and that
from
really,
there you went on to other things, and
mhm.
um, you have a regional, but you're also acquiring a national presence as well, are you not?
Yes, and
Can
I
you talk
think
about
that,
that a little bit?
well, I think social media had a lot to do with that because, as I began to focus on this DC area, a lot of opportunities began to open up for me. One of the major opportunities was when Jesus, Dr. Daryl Taylor, who's the founder of the African American Art Song Alliance, he had this big conference at the University of California at Irvine. He had this
Yes.
big conference, and he welcomed me to come and do this major presentation on social media. And the main tagline that I said that you are your own PR. A lot of times people rest their notoriety or the knowledge that people have of them. They base it on somebody else telling their story, but you are your own PR. You
Hmm.
are your own press person. And so
Hmm.
I drove that home, and that presentation resonated with a lot of people. So, I think social media was very instrumental in me having a more, I would say, regional and national presence. The groups that I formed. I remember when I first formed the group, Famous African American Singers of Concert and Operatic Literature. When I formed that group, it was only maybe like 600 or 700 people. Now it's like over 3,000 people. And I think the time that we are in has contributed to that as well because people are really trying to feel at one in this whole climate of racial equity and racial diversity. But
Yeah.
I definitely think that social media was the way that I was able to really get all of my writing out there. Even with LA Opera, the recent piece that I just was approached to write, it was a mixture of names that people know, and it was a mixture of names that people who they did know. But
Mhm.
more and more. Um, entities now are seeing what has always been there, as far as the writing. But I'm sure you have some things that you want to ask me as far as the music criticism piece.
Well, one of the things that and you're speaking about social media is, where do you see music going in the immediate future post pandemic? There's a lot of content online right now. I can't even keep up. I was like, I just can't keep up. I'm trying to get my own work done, and hopefully when the summer rolls around and school is out, um, but what do you think is happening? Because see, right now, and specifically as singers, but not just as singers, but as instrumentalists in classical music. Quo vadis, where do we go? Because people are knocking down the doors. But what I'm saying is, right now, there's all of this change happening. Is it going to last? How can we maximize it? Not just for ourselves as African Americans, I would say, but for all artists, so you can have a viable life as economically, artistically. What are your thoughts on the future of the music business and how you fit into it as a music critic? There's power in the tongue.
Definitely. Well,
Approval.
Carol, I'm gonna start with the first part of your question. First of all, this aspect of technology and social media, even with the pandemic, when you know, if the Lord sees it fit that we're all vaccinated and all of that, I still think that this technology piece is still going to be a very important piece. This whole presence on social media, um, artists, particularly I would say older artists, who may not be tech savvy, they're going to have to get the technology under their wing even more. Because I think that even when it comes to when the concert halls open up, I think that people are realizing that the money and the expense is, to me, in my opinion, is going to be greater. Because if you think about it, when the concert halls open up and they do have this kind of dual situation where you have people in the hall, but you have the presentations that are being streamed and things like that, that takes a lot of money in itself with the technology that is
Hmm.
involved with the cameras, the quality of the stream. And it's just so much more. I think that you're going to be spending much more, um, even when the pandemic is over, because, to produce these things of quality that someone is going to even want to pay it in a virtual climate. I think that is a big thing that a lot of these halls and presenters definitely had to consider. Just like last night, the Choral Arts Society of Washington and the Washington Performing Arts Men, Women, and Children of the Gospel, they usually do this big concert every year called Living the Dream, Singing the Dream. Every year it's a big thing at the Kennedy Center. But they had to pivot and they had to do it virtually. But Carolyn, the quality was of such that you would want to pay for it. And so I'm saying that to say you have top tier artists who they have top tier names, but they're going to have to really get that technology piece if they are going to sustain themselves in a financial way in
Well,
this
one of
climate.
the things, and because I'm a kind of DIY with this little project, and I want to up my game a bit, so I have to call in somebody to either train me or to do the segments. I go on iMovie and I put in my titles and my little credits at the end and all of this, and that's all well and fine up to a point, because for me, this is more like an act of love. But if you do want to monetize it, because our eyes and our ears are so acclimated to, Hollywood high level professional production, then if you can't do it yourself, you need to call somebody in. But as a critic, they're talking about what will opera look like, in terms of now, because of Black Lives Matters, all of a sudden everybody's paying attention. They're getting this composer, this diversity officer, and whatnot, and it's very interesting. Um, I'm wondering what will be the outcome. And maybe we just have to wait and see. A young woman was just named head of the Fort Worth Opera, which I think was
After battle.
absolutely amazing. Yeah. Wonderful singer, by the way.
Yes,
Wonderful
yes.
singer. And so, there all of these elements are in place to move forward positively. And I guess the question is, where are we going? Are we going to keep doing Butterfly and Aida? Are we going to keep doing Porgy and Bess? Um, what are your
Well, I'm
thoughts?
going to say this, and I may get myself in trouble, but I'm willing to risk that because I just talked about this. I think that it's well and good that this social and racial climate has propelled other people to look at the talent and the worth and the excellence that has always been in the Black community, always.
Hmm.
You and I kind of connected, I would say, largely because of the sense of community that you share with me, and I read about the community that the late Raul Abdul really fostered. He wasn't just a critic; he was somebody that the artist, even though he was giving his critique, for lack of better words, the artist knew that he had a concern, he had an interest, he had a passion to foster and to continue to foster that excellence, that musical and artistic excellence that resided in the community. You know what I'm saying? So,
Yeah, just for those people that don't know, we want to say that Raul Abdul was the longtime music critic for the Amsterdam News, which is a newspaper based in Harlem, but it has a national footprint. And before that, he was also the assistant to Langston Hughes, and he was a singer in his own right. He used to have music master classes on German Lieder. He studied in Vienna, if I recall. Saw that they were having these master classes at the Harlem School for the Arts. And the first time I walked through those doors at the Harlem School for the Arts was to attend Raul Abdul's master classes. It was like a lecture series on on African American composers. And that's when I first met Raul, and
wow.
it was life changing. Just meeting him, being at the Harlem School, eventually reconnecting with Betty Allen because I had met her years before in Cincinnati when she was there to sing the St. Matthew Passion. Um, but it was, it was a whole different kind of atmosphere, environment, support, loving community. And so I just wanted to throw that in about Raul because, yeah. And he wrote a book.
Thank you. Yes, Blacks in Classical Music.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but where I was really going with that to get to the really the crux of this question, there's a movement, not just that we see out in the streets of like the protests and things that happen as a result of George Floyd and others in our community who have been slain at the hands of police brutality and things of that nature. So the outcry is not just in the community in essence, but the outcry is also in the Black community that we use our Black bodies in this artistic enterprise, and a lot of times that in classical music per se, our gifts, are not celebrated. And there's an uprising, you know, amongst us to really demand, for lack of better words, that appreciation. But I do want to say this. I think in these efforts where we're seeking this acceptance, that we have to be careful that we don't set it up in such a way that we are strong arming like these enterprises and these institutions, that we still at the end of the day, if you're in the classical music arena, if you're still seeking to be performing at these major opera houses, I know people don't want to have this conversation, but sometimes I think within this culture of social media, we have the tendency uh, to to shame to shame institutions into doing something,
Yeah.
and to get to the point that what I'm saying is, if people want to include you, if they want to celebrate you and celebrate your presence and your efforts, then they're going to do it from the heart anyway. But I just feel like that if you put it in a position where, yeah, you want diversity, you want equity and all this, I don't think it's gonna come when it's done in a sense that, if you don't do this, we're gonna put you on blast, or we're going to, you know what I'm saying?
Well,
I,
I would like to share with you some of my thoughts as well because
Mhm.
I've seen on the boards, as I call it, social media, and there's some things happening with the union, which I won't discuss. But hearing these conversations, and my first thought is, number one, have you cut your teeth where you can really walk through that door and be ready? Have you been to the it's one thing that, if there's an issue at the young artist level or the apprenticeship level. It's another thing if you sang in the chorus somewhere and then all of a sudden you expect to be on the main stage. Is your expectation realistic? If you have the voice, do you have the experience? Are your languages in place? There are a lot of elements. And one of the things that I did a couple of months ago now, I did like a little conference, all my stuff is little, on Black, Indigenous, and people of color opera companies. Because if these artists will come out and support these opera companies by auditioning and raising their level, the quality of their performances, it may mean you may not get that union fee, but you will get the experience that you need so that when the other companies in Chicago or San Francisco or New York or Montreal or wherever, Philadelphia call, you can unequivocally say, yeah, I can do that. That's not a problem, you know. But if the focus is on trying to knock down a door and you are not ready, I'm not making a judgment on anybody because I can't, you know, I'm not in the cliques. I'm not in the cliques or the circles. I'm outside of the circle. So I do my own thing. But I would be in agreement in that sense. The other thing too is what's that expression? Study to show yourself approved, right? So all those people, the pictures behind you, they've had different levels, huge levels of career, some not as big, but significant body of work. And it didn't come by not being prepared. So that I think that's the first step. And maybe, as a music critic, you can share that, whereas say a director or someone may not be able to, because then some people take it personally when it's not personal, because at the end of the day it's about the production and can you carry this production on your shoulders. you know you have to learn how to do it. There has to be a place. I would say patronize the smaller opera companies because they need good artists. you know and it's a win-win all the way around. What the other thing I want to talk with you about was, you just had an announcement. Let me see what that was. You're on the board.
Of the Music Critics Association of North America.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly?
It being a great milestone for me because I kind of mentioned, I think about my journey on this leg of my career in the writing, the criticism, and arts journalism. I think
But
about,
Patrick, aren't you one of one? Aren't you one of one?
I think I'm one of one. I think I'm one of many that people don't know. That's what I'm saying. Like how you asked me before, uh, if I can paraphrase, basically, I came into the profession uh, through the back door. So sometimes we have these degree programs, and I'm not knocking degree programs in journalism, but I'm just saying I
Mm-hmm.
came in through the back door. You have a lot of fine writers, a lot of people who do this, and they come in through the back door, but because they don't necessarily focus on a certain aspect of the performing arts or music or whatever, they're not necessarily, and for lack of better expression, some might not even see me as a true journalist because I didn't go. And I think that sometimes we look for these institutions or programs to validate a talent that is already in us. There are plenty of people who, yeah, went to an arts journalism school or music criticism, or whatever the case may be, but they have not had maybe perhaps like the musical experience to complement the
Yeah,
writing. But
yeah,
there are a lot of writers. I think about Alicia Hall Moran. Alicia Hall Moran is an excellent writer. Matter of fact, I would say she's a connection, a strong connection with Raul Abdul because, for a long time when there wasn't a critic or a
She was
writer in
writing
the
at the
art.
Amsterdam. Yeah, I
Yeah,
never.
she was
Yeah.
writing. She was writing. And there's so many voices like that that I don't know whether you have people who don't necessarily know about the Music Critics Association of America or whatever. But the only reason I know about it is because I've always been someone in terms of, when I was on the journey, I don't have a problem with seeking mentors, black, green, white, polka dot. If somebody is willing to mentor me, I'm open to that. But the thing that I find that, you have to be open to be a mentor. That's one thing. And I'm finding that in this kind of culture now, the least little thing that you offer, even, whether it's criticism, um, good or bad, in this climate, sometimes is not well received. So
Yeah, I think that's a problem and it's unfortunate, but there's also a saying, many are called but few are chosen, right?
yeah.
So in your work on the board, are you going to work with now as you're becoming more established, or work with younger music critics and
That is my desire. I've been mentoring, not necessarily music critics per se, but I've been doing a lot of mentoring. I
Mhm.
don't know if you recall, I had it's been kind of dormant now because it's been so much going on. But my pilot program, Reaching for Excellence, where I have about 10 to 12, not just young artists, but I have a variety of people in the arts who respect me, and we have one-on-one sessions and Zooms and things like that, like projects they're working on. But it is my desire with this position on the board. I would love to, and not just love to, I plan on um, really introducing some writers of color and diversify. Because I'll be honest, I think I mentioned to you, I have been a member of the Music Critics Association for 8 years. I was
Mhm.
accepted into membership back in 2012. And so the interesting thing is, I never got a chance to go to an annual meeting because the annual meetings were all in these different places around the country. So I was supposed to go to the annual meeting, 2020. But of
Pandemic.
course, it got
Yeah.
canceled because of the pandemic, and it was supposed to be in San Francisco. So what I'm leading up to is, I've been a member of this organization for 8 years. They've seen my, pieces. We've
Mhm.
had email correspondence, but the first time that this organization was able to associate a name with a face was because of our annual meeting. It was via Zoom. And I was the only African American classical music critic or arts journalist on this Zoom. Not to say there haven't been other members of the organization, because I'm sure there are, but
Mhm.
active and being present. A lot of times, first of all, Carolyn, it works to my advantage and disadvantage. A lot of times when people see my byline, as you mentioned, when they see my name, they think I'm a white writer.
McCoy.
Yeah, if you don't see my picture, if you're not on social media, you engage me, and But sometimes I've had cases where I have, been, approached, and they want me to cover a story, whomever. But when I get to the event, the person has to regroup because my name is Patrick D. McCoy. They assume that I'm an Irish writer unless you make the connection, in social media, or you see my picture. If you're just a publication and you want your press out, and you seek me to cover something, and you see my name, I'm just
But
Patrick
you're
D.
a
McCoy.
writer. This is part of the thing, because we could always talk about the affronts that we've experienced in our careers, right? We can talk.
Mhm.
I could tell you stories. All right. Um, but the thing I like to focus on is, where are we now? How did we get here? Where are we now? And where are we going? And unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I have one more question for you, and I think I know the
Okay.
answer to this. If there were no obstacles and you could interview any person in the world, who would it be?
You're gonna make me get emotional. It would be Cafe Battle. Um, I just, as I mentioned, like, she and Wynn Marsalis, but particularly her, I just think that she has a story, um, that needs to be told, particularly Black women. I have a lot of Black women, female friends who are excellent in their right. And sometimes I think that when strong Black women walk into certain spaces, not just opera, just certain spaces, period, and that light is too bright, they get dimmed. So yeah, it will be Kathleen Battle, and I hope that.
Now,
So
I'm going to say this. I'm not a fairy godmother, but
yeah,
if I have any wish for you, I hope your wish comes true. Thank you
yeah.
so much, Patrick McCoy. What does the D stand for? David? Daniel?
I'm gonna share this probably one of the few times, but my middle name is Del Sean.
Delshawn. Okay, that's a nice name. But I want to thank.
But on Facebook, people might see that it's Damal Chaye. That was the famous photographer. If you ever watched The Devil Wears Prada, the well-known photographer was Patrick Damal Chaye. So that's where I got that little nickname from.
Well, listen, I want to thank you for spending this time with me. This next to last Saturday of Black History Month, African American History Month, and we will continue next week. We will have a gentleman who is also an educator and has a wonderful story to tell as well. So thank you so much, Patrick, and we'll be back next week.
Thank you so much.